Music sucks. I hate all music now. I really don't like to listen to music very much.
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and today we are here to talk about the one and only Faith No More, who are easily one of the most iconic bands of the 90s and 2000s, starting with their breakout hit Epic in 1990. But they are way more than just that song. They're cited as a huge influence by a ton of bands that are honestly pretty legendary in their own right. For example, Nirvana, Deftones, and Slipknot, to name just a few. And despite not being an active band, like the last time they toured or released an album was, I think, 7 years ago, they are still very, very relevant. Like, they come up in the comments of almost half of my videos, despite the fact that a lot of times they play very weird, almost like anti-commercial music. So how do they do it? How did they go from basically toiling in obscurity for almost 10 years to becoming one of the most iconic, influential bands in their entire generation of rock and metal? Those are the questions that I will answer in this video. But first, if you haven't, please check me out on Twitch. I'm streaming twice a week from 4 to 7 p.m. Pacific on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and there is a link to that in the description of this video. If you are like me and you are too busy to cook, or maybe you just don't like it, that's me too, then definitely check out today's sponsor, Factor. I've been working with these guys for quite a while now, and I genuinely think it is a great product. Personally, I care a lot about eating clean, and they make that super, super easy. They have over 34 chef-prepared, dietitian-approved meals with options like keto, calorie smart, vegan/veggie, and protein plus. And it's also a great way to save money. Going to restaurants is crazy expensive these days. Honestly, I think it's a waste of money. And with Factor, you will also eat a lot healthier. Personally, I really like that I can hit all my macro and calorie goals without spending a bunch of time cooking. I just go downstairs, pick something out of the fridge, and I am good to go in 2 minutes. So if you want to check out Factor, and I think you should, head to factor75.com or click the link below and use the code PUNK50 to get 50% off your first Factor box. Like most people, I discovered Faith No More in 1990 when Epic came out, but the band was actually formed way back in 1979 in San Francisco, but they weren't called Faith No More just yet. At first, the band was called Sharp Young Men, then they changed their name to Faith No Man, and their very first release was a 7-inch way back in 1983 with 2 songs on it, Quiet in Heaven and Song of Liberty. And this was with their original vocalist, Mike the Man Morris, and considering the circumstances, it doesn't sound too bad for the very first thing they did together as a band. Very reminiscent of bands like Killing Joke or Joy Division. And shortly after that, their original vocalist left the band, and they changed their name from Faith No Man to Faith No More, which was a play on the fact that their original vocalist was the man, and he was now no more. Actually, kind of funny. And they tried out a few vocalists, including the one and only Courtney Love.
I saw Faith No More playing with Gun Club, and they had a crap singer, and I demanded to be in their band. And then I broke a bottle over my head. That is the legend.
Before eventually settling on Chuck Mosley as their vocalist. But I keep asking myself, what would the world look like if they had gone with Courtney Love? Might be better that we never found out.
Oh, it's such a bad lie. It was so awful.
And with their lineup all set, in 1985, they released their debut album, We Care a Lot. And even though it is a little bit rough around the edges, it does a good job of setting the foundation for what was to come in the future for the band. And 2 years later, they released their second album, Introduce Yourself, which is the first time that they saw any kind of real success with the revamped version of their song We Care a Lot, which did get some airplay on MTV shows like 120 Minutes. But even as the band was starting to get some success, behind the scenes, there was trouble. Specifically, after the release of their second album, their vocalist Chuck Mosley was getting a bit erratic, to say the least. For example, he fell asleep on stage, or maybe nodded out, I don't know, during the album's release party. And he was also getting into a ton of fights with the other members of the band, both on and off stage, which eventually led to him getting fired. And for a lot of bands, losing their frontman right as they were starting to get some success would be the worst thing that could ever happen to them. But for Faith No More, that was not the case. Because as most of you probably know, this is when the legendary Mike Patton replaced Chuck Mosley as the vocalist of Faith No More in 1988. He joined at the suggestion of Faith No More's guitarist Jim Martin after Jim heard the demo of Mike Patton's old band Mr Bungle, which sounded something like this. Which was an interesting choice, considering that demo basically sounds like early death metal, whereas Faith No More's music was much more accessible, like, alternative rock, more or less. And as a quick side note about the Mr Bungle demo, that recording was released in 1986, a full year before Scream Bloody Gore by Death, and only a few months after Seven Churches by Possessed, which are the two albums that are kind of considered the beginning of death metal. And I don't really hear Mr Bungle getting the credit that they probably deserve for being part of the early death metal scene. And after Mike Patton joined the band, everything was about to change for the band in June of 1989 when they released their breakthrough album, The Real Thing, featuring the video for the lead single Epic, which got a ton of airplay on MTV. And like I said earlier, this is when I first heard Faith No More. I was in 6th or 7th grade, and I definitely remember trying to copy Mike Patton's dance moves. And I just thank God that social media didn't exist so that there is no video evidence of that. And that album was a massive success. If you were around back then, you will remember that Epic was just all over like alternative radio and Headbangers Ball and 120 Minutes. And to this day, it is still their biggest song commercially. And musically, honestly, it was just an all-around better record than their first two. And despite the Chuck Mosley era having its diehard fans, I think it is pretty safe to say that Mike Patton is just an overall better vocalist and a much, much more charismatic frontman. And so you put those two things together, the band improving musically, plus the addition of Mike Patton as the frontman, and there you have it.
Despite the group's extreme style and unusual combination of influences, Faith No More has been winning fans steadily and gaining mainstream recognition too, including a Grammy nomination this year in the heavy metal category.
And after doing some touring and releasing a live album, the band did not rest on their laurels, and on June 8th of 1992, they released what is oftentimes considered to be their magnum opus and most significant album, Angel Dust. It was yet another massive success, debuting at number 10 on Billboard. It won a ton of Album of the Year awards by all kinds of different magazines, and to this day, it is regarded as one of the best, most influential, and important albums in the entire history of rock and metal. And compared to The Real Thing, Angel Dust is a much more adventurous album. The Real Thing was a relatively straightforward kind of funk metal album, I guess you could say, which was very popular at the time. But Angel Dust is really just all over the place. I remember buying it at the time and being like, what is this? Where is the slap bass? 14-year-old me was not ready for this. For example, the album has a cover of the classic Lionel Richie song, Say, while also having songs that sound like this. And as you can tell, this is the album where Mike Patton really got the chance to show what an exceptional vocalist he is. His singing range alone is insane, as many people have documented, but he can also scream, he can rap, he's like a voice actor, an opera singer. When it comes to vocals, Mike Patton is honestly just on another level. Whether you like his music or not, you gotta admit that he is incredible. And even today, 30 years later, based on this album, there are a lot of people who would consider him one of, if not the best vocalists in the entire genre. Although, once again, there was trouble behind the scenes.
It's really hard to think of writing any music once we got back because I kind of burned out playing the same songs over and over every night.
The main thing being that their longtime guitarist Jim Martin, the man who brought Mike Patton into the band, was kind of having beef with the band over their change in direction. Think he was kind of more of a metal guy, and he called Angel Dust quote-unquote gay disco, and so the band fired him and replaced him with Mr. Bungle guitarist Trey Spruance. And then on March 28th, 1995, they released their next album, King for a Day, Fool for a Lifetime.
If you want to open the hole.
This was by far their most diverse album. Pretty much none of these songs sounded the same. It goes all the way from thrash metal to jazz to gospel to country. It's really just wild how diverse this album is. And if you were to show these two songs to someone, they probably wouldn't even believe that they were from the same band.
My lips are moving, but there's no sound.
The single Digging the Grave was also featured on Beavis and Butthead, which, as most of you probably know, was a huge deal back in the 90s, which was responsible for breaking a lot of bands like White Zombie and Pantera.
I'm tired. Hey buddy, you know who these guys are? No, and I don't care either. This is Faith No More. Yeah, right.
But despite all of that, this album was a lot more divisive than Angel Dust. It debuted at number 31 on Billboard and sold a lot less copies than Angel Dust did. And the critics were also a lot harsher on this album, with a lot of people kind of writing it off as disappointing and unfocused compared to their previous album, which personally I think is maybe just a reflection of people not being ready for this album or not understanding it at the time, because today the conversation about that album is very different. A lot of fans would actually cite this as their favorite album, and these days critics also kind of look at it differently, with a lot of them now saying that it was really underrated and one of the best albums of the 90s, kind of the same way as people changed their opinion about Pinkerton by Weezer years after the fact. And the band had even more lineup changes. Just after releasing the album, Trey Spruance quit the band and was replaced by John Hudson, who is their guitarist to this day. And in June of 1997, they released their next album called Album of the Year. And this one is actually a lot more straightforward compared to their previous two albums. It had a lot less experimentation and really was kind of going for more of like a consistent sound from track to track. And commercially, it performed a lot better than maybe they expected in a lot of other countries. For example, it went to number 2 in Germany and number 1 in Australia. In the US, it was their worst performing album by far, only hitting number 41 on Billboard. And critically, it was also slammed by a lot of the major publications. For example, Rolling Stone said that the band are floundering around desperately, groping for a sense of identity and direction in a decade that clearly finds them irrelevant. Well, Pitchfork's review went like this. Album of the Year leaves one feeling like waking up and finding last night's used condom. Sure, the ride was fun while it lasted, but what remains is just plain icky, and you definitely don't want to put it in your CD player. And the fans' reception was, well, it was not very nice either. After releasing this album and then going on tour with Limp Bizkit in 1997, their own fans were actually booing them on stage. And then in early 1998, rumors were circulating that Mike Patton was planning to quit the band to pursue his solo projects. And at the time, they denied the rumor, but despite that, on April 8th of 1998, after playing their final show in Lisbon, Portugal, they canceled their upcoming tour supporting Aerosmith and officially split up. The band released a statement via email and fax. I mean, it was the 90s, we still sent faxes, thanking all the fans that stuck by them and supported them, and that this decision was mutual among all the bandmates. And so this was the end of the band, or at least that's how it appeared at the time. And the question was, is the album that seemingly caused them to break up really that bad? And the answer is no, not really, at least for the most part. Although Mike Patton is definitely not a fan of it, as he went on record and said, "We were starting to make bad music, and that's when we need to pull the plug. Our next record would have been a piece of shit. But in hindsight, a lot of people actually look back fondly on this album. For example, John Dolmayan of System of a Down named it as one of the albums that changed his life. And Coheed and Cambria guitarist Travis Stever said that this album, along with the other Faith No More albums in the 90s, were some of their biggest sources of inspiration. And so again, I think it's a case where Faith No More is one of those bands that's going to put out an album that people aren't going to like or understand at the time, and people just need a little bit of time to digest it and come around to it. And after breaking up, the band members all kind of went off and did their own thing. Mike, for example, has a ton of different side projects that he continues to work on to this day. For example, Mr Bungle, his original band, a thrash metal project called Dead Cross, and a couple other bands spanning various different genres. He also composed a couple soundtracks for movies. Most notably, he did the soundtrack for the Stephen King Netflix movie 1922. And also, fun fact, he provided the voices for the monsters in the Will Smith movie I Am Legend. He also did some voice work in video games, most notably the Anger Sphere in the first Portal, and Darkness in The Darkness 1 and 2.
Yes! Take the siphon! Give me its power!
But despite all the members really honestly doing great in their own right with their different side projects, this was not the end for Faith No More. And on February 24th of 2009, the band announced that they were officially coming back with the same lineup as the Album of the Year era and played a couple of the big European festivals that year. And after playing some shows on and off, in May of 2015, they released their first album in 18 years, Soul Invictus. And honestly, it was great, which really says a lot about this band, because usually bands that are this late into their career, remember, they officially started in 1979. It's very rare for them to release anything that can in any way compare to their older stuff, but that is just not the case here. The songs are as good as ever, Mike is in top shape vocally. It's just overall a really, really strong album. And it debuted at number 15 on Billboard in America, hitting number 2 in Australia, and it won the Golden Gods Awards for Best Album in 2015.
London may I present Soul Invictus by Faith No More.
Which brings us to the final question of this video. What is their lasting impact? And honestly, this could almost be like a whole video on its own, but just to make a long story short, for one, we pretty much have to credit them with inventing or at least popularizing alternative metal, which is basically the concept of combining metal with other unrelated genres like hip hop and funk. They weren't the first band to do it by any means, but Epic was such a popular song that pretty much instantly inspired a whole wave of bands, either straight up copying Faith No More or at the very least taking a lot of influence from them. And that in itself inspired countless other bands like Deftones, Linkin Park, Slipknot, and of course Limp Bizkit. So yes, Faith No More walked so Limp Bizkit could run. I'm guessing Mike Patton is not super happy about that, but it is a fact. As a specific example of that, in 2015, Jacoby Shaddix of Papa Roach had this to say about Faith No More. They fused some of that hip hop and rock together. They were one of the earliest bands to do that and definitely pioneers to a whole genre. If you listen to Korn, if you listen to how the bass and the drums lock up, it's quite similar to how Faith No More was doing it in their early years. And so with all of that in mind, although the band has kind of had their ups and downs commercially and maybe haven't been mainstream for a long time, I think you have to say that their overall contribution to rock and metal has been massive. And I'm not sure when they will decide to permanently hang it up and call it a day for the band, but when they do, I think we will look back at them even more than we already do as one of the most important bands in rock and metal, and honestly, for good reason. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments, and I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my main channel videos and podcasts podcasts a week early. I do giveaways. There are members-only channels in my Discord that I'm super active in, and there's a way to have me review your music if that is something you are interested in. So if that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.